In this lecture, I want to address another major component and understanding in our first chapter here in Module 1. And that is this idea of what developmentally appropriate practices are and how that relates to literacy. Remember, every time we say the word literacy, we are referring to oral language development, written language, in the fine motor skills related to that, as well as the understanding in how we write and draw and communicate through a written symbolic form, and then as well as how we read, how we interpret and process that print and picture and visual stimulation in communication. So what is DAP? It's developmentally appropriate practice. There are three components to developmentally appropriate practice. And one of those is something developmentally appropriate. Well, what does that mean? Appropriate means that it is a good decision. It's based on fact, that it is sound. So is it developmentally sound? Is it a good idea developmentally for a child in this situation? And so does this match, the question is does this match what we know about child development? Is it developmentally appropriate to read short stories to an infant? Yes. Some of you may be too young to remember the movie 3 Men and a Baby, but there's this great scene in 3 Men and a Baby where and it's about 3 men, single men, who are raising an infant. And so as you can, it has a lot of gender humor to it. And child development humor. But there's a wonderfully cute scene where one of the fathers is reading to the infant from a magazine, and it's rather violent content. And one of the other men say, "What are you doing?" And he says, "It doesn't matter what I'm reading, it's how I'm reading it." And actually, that is 100% correct. It is that tone, it is that communication. Now, with that said, are there books that are more appropriate? Should we all start reading Little House on the Prairie to our babies? No, there's things that are more engaging and appropriate and in alignment towards development of children. But again, it was an exaggeration of a point. So we have to think about milestones. Is it appropriate to expect a toddler to be able to write their name? No, that doesn't fit developmental facts about what we know about how toddlers can control writing utensils. Does that mean toddlers shouldn't have access to pencils and pens and crayons and markers? Absolutely not. In fact, we know that they need that access and they need that time to use those tools. So, but all of those decisions are based on what we know about child development in general. It's a big picture question. This is where our Kansas Early Learning Standards come into play. And this assignment that you're going to do this week, where you bring in the bullets from the textbook on milestones and you compare them to what is presented in the Kansas Early Learning Standards. The Kansas Early Learning Standards are not your curriculum. They are not the end-all be-all. But they are a place where we can go and say, how does that relate to expectations that have been looked through by this group of professionals? I'm going to use an example of toddlers. If you look in our Kansas Early Learning Standards in the communications portion, there is a section the first section's on literature. And it's the range of reading and level of text complexity on page 30. Says a child will first listen briefly to stories being read by an adult. So will they listen to the whole story? No, they'll listen briefly. Second, listen to stories being read by an adult. So note, the word taken out here is briefly. So now as a mobile infant, they're going to listen a little bit longer. Number 3, engages in reading activities with an adult and possibly 1 or 2 peers. That's for toddler. So that's by 36 months. Only 1 or 2 peers. Preschool, 3 years old, actively engages in small group reading activities with purpose and understanding. So asks for a favorite book to be read, giggles when he hears something funny read in a story. That's how the child's engaged. Preschool 4, actively engages in large and small group reading activities with purpose and understanding, asks for a favorite book to be read, participates in reciting rhymes and finger plays using accompanying gestures. Question: did I say anything about raising a hand for any of those phases? No. Second question: when was beyond small group, so large group, introduced as a standard, as a benchmark? Not until 60 months old, preschool 4, second year of preschool. Does that mean you shouldn't introduce a 3-year-old to whole group reading time? No, that's not what that means. Does it mean that you should hold circle time for toddlers? Definitely. I just said it. I said not. That was the key word I used. You should not hold circle time for toddlers. It is horribly developmentally inappropriate. That doesn't mean that 3 or 4 toddlers might not sit with you and read, or 1 or 2. But to expect them to sit there and read with you and look at pictures as a whole group. So for many toddler rooms, that's anywhere from 6 to 12 children, depending on the ratio of adults. It is not an appropriate practice. What is a much better practice is for an adult to sit down in the classroom and look at a book, which will eventually draw the attention of another child to bring a book and to read with the child individually or with 1 or 2 children. But the expectation that toddlers should engage in whole group circle time is not a developmentally appropriate practice, and it's based on developmentally appropriate. A second component of developmentally appropriate practice is this individually appropriate? So we just looked at groups as a whole regarding scientific child development, ages and stages, if you will. Individually appropriate, though, looks at each child on the developmental continuum. We know that children don't all develop at the same rate, and that actually from 0 to 8 years old, there's a lot of variance in where children are developing stronger in some areas rather than others. I'm going to give the example of my son. My son was born on June 30th. He started attending kindergarten when he was 5 years old. He's much younger than a lot of his peers. He is now in the 3rd grade. So he will not turn 9 until this summer. And until this year, he worked hard. He's a hard worker. And you could tell there were parts of his development that were just slightly behind some of his peers. And athletically, he still is a little less mature than some of his classmates who are almost a year older. However, that gap between William and his classmates is closing greatly. And now he is one of the strongest readers in his classroom. Like, he's at the top. And academically, he's always been strong, but a lot of that has been he's had good home support. But there have been some things that have been a little more challenging. Why did Beth feel comfortable starting William in kindergarten, knowing that he was going to be one of the youngest kids? I'll tell you why. It's because I know child development. And child development says from 0 to 8 years old, you will see a range and a variance in rate of development across the developmental domains. But by the end of 3rd grade, between the years of 9 and 10 years old, you see that rate get much closer and even out. And I was venturing to guess that I was not raising an Olympic athlete. And, well, I knew that. And I was venturing to play the safe bet that I was not raising even a collegiate athlete, meaning he would play at in college for scholarship money in athletics. He might, but I knew that natural talent probably wasn't there. It's not there in the family line at all. And with that knowledge, I was perfectly comfortable, and so was my husband, in William starting kindergarten because I knew the family was ready. So there were certain areas that William was a little lower than his classmates on that kindergarten continuum. But especially one of the big things is fine motor development, because he's a boy, and we know there's a gender difference in fine motor development and rate and level of expertise and control, as well as he's a left-handed child. So I use him as an example of individually appropriate. There are expectations along the way that I've had at different grade levels that I had much sooner for my daughter than I had for William, but I knew where they were age-wise within that continuum and that understanding. And so that always played a role in what we expected from him and knew he could do. Third component of DAP is culturally appropriate. So what does this mean? You know, culture is what we experience at home. It's our belief, it's our values. And so it's recognizing what the child has experienced at home, but also it's recognizing the family values, beliefs, and lifestyle. So, for example, a lot of families value safety and control and neatness in their home. And I understand that. I get that. And I think most of us do. But if I am a working parent and my child's going to child care, I'm very busy. We appreciate that, right? And I don't have time necessarily to always sit with my child. If I'm very worried about my child getting hurt, I don't always have time to sit with my toddler so my toddler can play with scissors. So instead, I always am taking scissors away, saying, no, you can't have those. No, you can't have those. I'm not trying to control and hurt my child, and by not letting them have the experience of cutting with scissors, I don't want them to get hurt. And so my child hasn't had the experience to play with scissors. You know, arts and crafts materials are expensive. That's something that my family values, and we splurge on that. And so we make room for that money in our budget. But I have to recognize, and my children have to recognize, that they are expensive. And so actually just yesterday, I put a moratorium on buying anything of the kids spending any of their money to buy anything new, because I was flustered because I went into their play area and they're way too disorganized, and I felt like they weren't showing that they valued or treated their materials well. And so because of that, they now need to demonstrate to me that they really can take care of what they have. And so, you know, that's the fancy scissors that have different designs in them and shapes when you cut. That's the fun hole punches and the markers and the pins. And those are things that we value and we can't afford. And we're lucky to be able to do that. So I'm giving examples of how my kids are coming with experiences that not every child has. And so we have to recognize that. Some of you might find frustration when children can't use spoons or forks very well at that toddler preschool age, when they really should be independently feeding themselves and they don't. Well, on a flip side of it, if you have to take your laundry to the laundromat and you can only do that once a week, you probably don't want your child to get a lot of food on themselves. You don't have, or if you don't have the space to soak bibs and clothes and deal with the stains, OxyClean is expensive. And so if I don't have that time, energy, or money or space, then my values of control and neatness are going to be greater. Does this make sense? I hope so. And so these are the three considerations of developmentally appropriate practice. Developmental milestones, scientific knowledge of ages and stages. Individual, recognizing that even with ages and stages of child development milestones, there is lots of variation within that, and looking at children individually, not just as an age group. And then culturally, what does the family value, the beliefs, the lifestyle, and how that impacts the child and their experiences that they have. One of the quotes from the book is that, we have facts to teach literacy. And we know that the first critical steps occur very early in life. That is directly related to brain research. And later in this course and in other courses you've had at Allen in early childhood education, you have been exposed to the Harvard Center for Child Development that has done an extensive amount of research and has a lot of resources out there on brain development in infants. We know that failure to have early experiences severely limits later success. You may have heard the term word gap, and we know, and I believe I said it earlier in a lecture, that children from living in poverty compared to children from professional homes, so not just affluent, but professional homes, so the parents have college degrees and are working more office-type jobs, statistically, you talk to their children more and use richer vocabulary. And those two pieces severely limit children who don't have those experiences. And so we have to understand that and figure out how we address that. And lastly, early literacy instruction cannot include ineffective and inappropriate teaching practices. I harped on this a lot in the first module, in the first lecture, and I'll use the word harp because I did. It's a soapbox. But I cannot stress enough that a lot of us are seeing inappropriate literacy instruction, number one, or two, a lack of quality literacy instruction or instruction at all. Instruction does not mean a teacher talking to children and showing. It means experiences. It means happenings in the classroom. It means opportunities. An opportunity is not a mandate. It is not a craft. It's things that are around that a child can happen upon that are rich. And we also see this, as I stressed earlier, in the lack of success in our middle schoolers, high schoolers, and then college students. So using the Kansas Early Learning Standards, as we stated, as you had to state in your quizzes, is that it provides a checks and balances to see if our expectations match what we know about child development. Are there gaps or missing abilities or skills in particular children? And how does it compare to our textbook? And so in this next video right here, I'm going to actually play you a lecture that I've embedded. I'm sorry I had to use my camera phone so that you can watch how I get this assignment. And so I'm going to play that for you now of how to get started on this assignment in Module 1 where you're comparing the textbook to the Kansas Early Learning Standards. In Module 1, we are doing an assignment where you're going to use your textbook and your Kansas Early Learning Standards to compare the expectations communicated regarding infants, toddlers, preschoolers, and kindergartners in language development. This includes oral language, reading, and writing. I wanted to give you an example here, although I hesitate to do that too many times. I do like you to make assignments your own. So as long as you are meeting the goals of this assignment, I am okay with you not doing exactly how I show you today, but hopefully it will help the assignment to make better sense to you and maybe be less daunting. Do you have to write absolutely every bullet from the textbook? No, not at all. But what you do have to do is somehow note within the Kansas Early Learning Standards when a bullet from the textbook is being addressed in the Kansas Early Learning Standards. So you'll see here I chose 3 colors, purple, green, and blue ink pens. Those correspond with 0 to 3 in the textbook, 3 to 4 in the textbook, and kindergarten, because if I turn the page here, you'll see there it classifies 3 to 4-year-olds and kindergarten accomplishments, right? Okay, and so I've used the blank note on the Communications and Standards page. I've used the blank page on the Kansas Early Learning Standards Communication and Literacy page to make my notes. And so what I'm going to do here is my key, because you have to understand what my notes mean. And if I walk away from this and I look at this tomorrow, I won't remember what color I used to note what area. And so I'm actually walking through this new assignment as well as you are. So essentially, I'm going to show you what I got as the answers for 0 to 3, because I have done page 19 and all the bullets, and I'm going to show you how I did that. I've noted here, walking through the bullets that weren't addressed well or fully in the Kansas Early Learning Standards. I noted the page from the textbook, and then for the most part, I wrote it out. But like you'll see that below these last two, I didn't write them as completely as before. And so the way I did this is I actually looked here at a bullet. And so like this first one is recognize specific books by cover. And I started flipping through the Kansas Early Learning Standards. Sorry for my amateur video, but I figured this was easier than trying to just lecture with still pictures. And so what I've done is I've ended up circling when something is duplicated or underlined when something wasn't. Okay, or mentioned, addressed, but not necessarily duplicated. So this one is responds to a verbal prompt by pointing to requested picture. If I look over here at my birth to 3 accomplishments, that is very similar to label objects in books, but it's not exactly the same thing. So that is why I just underlined that. That is also why I underlined this one. Names familiar people, objects, and photographs. Because that's related. Now this, craft structure, shows interest in books, actively participates, show an appreciation. Those are all directly related to the bullet. Enters into book sharing routine with primary caregivers. And pretty much that's it. I go further down on that same page and relates characteristics or actions of the characters in a story to self. That is addressing the bullet in Birth to 3 that says comments on characters in books. The last one, range of reading and level complexity. So listens briefly to stories, listens to stories being read by adult, engages in reading activities with an adult and possibly 1 or 2 peers. That would be enters into book sharing routine with primary caregivers. Okay, I flip to the second page of the early literacy standards. And you see, you'll notice there's a lot not circled. The Kansas Early Learning Standards are much more specific than the bullets in our textbook. Both are valid. There's sometimes a slightly different perspective, and I'll show you that in just a minute. Okay? So it shows interest in books and pictures. Again, participation bullet. Flip it again. We have the range of reading complexity, and that is listens briefly to text. So again, the routine. So sometimes there's redundancy, and you can see how the Kansas Early Learning Standards has taken a big idea, like entering into a book sharing routine with caregivers, into broken it down in much bigger steps, or much smaller steps. Print concept. Explores a book by turning the pages. Holds book right side up. And so that is pretends to read books and understands that books are handled in a particular way. You'll see I did not circle in infancy. Explores books by touching, patting, and mouthing. That's not the appropriate way. But again, the Kansas Early Learning Standards has broken in this ultimate goal of understanding how to handle a book into steps and how we see that in child development. This I hope this is helping to make more sense. I keep flipping. Here's writing foundational skills. And so look here, I made note, may begin to attend to specific print is not specifically stated in the standards. It is stated in the textbook, and so, but it's related to these 3-year-old standards. And so I made an arrow though there, because that made sense to me. I flip again, and you'll see like on this page I've only done one, but here I underlined what was addressed in birth to 3 in our textbook. Yes, this is 3 years old. That's okay, because what we're going to see is sometimes an overlap in expectations or a slight change or difference in expectations. And that's okay. We just need to be aware of these things. Flip again, comprehension and collaboration, underlining. One thing that's popping out to me is when I flip here back to the beginning, our Kansas Early Literacy Standards talk a lot about responding to verbal prompts and answering questions and retelling. And that's nothing that's identified here in birth to 3 milestones in our textbook. There's nothing here about responding to literacy. There's also nothing in our Kansas Early Literacy Standards about requesting or commanding that adults read or write. That doesn't really get into the joy or the appreciation or the desire to read and write that toddlers and infants show. So there's a different emphasis, and I want you to think about that as you complete this assignment. So I hope this helps this assignment not look so intimidating. So I didn't write that much. I mostly just circled and made notes, underlined as appropriate when it was close to, but maybe not an exact relation. And so you'll see there's a lot that's not addressed necessarily. So now I would flip, and I would get my, well, let's see, go back to my key here, and I'll get my green ink pen and turn the page in my textbook, and I'll walk through the bullets for 3 to 4-year-old accomplishments. Do your answers have to be exactly like my answers? No, of course not. We're going to interpret things slightly different, and that's okay. They may not be grossly different. I would encourage you to not be too nitpicky, but at the same time to not overgeneralize milestones and bullets. So just, be critical in your thinking and analytical and thoughtful and take your time. This assignment will likely take you about an hour to complete. And as always, if you have questions, make sure you ask those either in the class, on the discussion board forum, or by email or call or text. So hopefully this has helped you understand a little bit this assignment in Module 1 as it relates to this information and the details expected. So literacy development, the textbook says, why, what, and how. The why. Why do you read and write? Sometimes it's for entertainment, sometimes it's for grocery lists, sometimes it's to text and communicate to other people. One thing our textbook does not do a good job of is discuss technology, and we will talk about that and its influence on children and their development. And why do you talk? Talking on the phone is a lot different than what it used to be because a lot of us do communicate by email and text. And how does that impact children and what they learn about conversation? So what? I'm actually going to go back. Sorry. What? This second column, the middle column, and the picture. Is this what we want? Is this a language-rich environment? And I put a big old red X on it. No, it is not. That is overwhelming. That is disorganized. It's organized in one sense, but it's yet disorganized and chaotic in another. There's too much. It's not on the child's level. It has no meaning to that child. This is not appropriate. If you have this in your preschool classroom, if you're in a preschool, I hope you take it down before the end of the semester. I hope we convince you why this is not developmentally appropriate. So I put a big red X on it. Look around your home. What is there to read? What do you use to write? Is that accessible? Can you pick it up, or is it put away, out of sight? There's a lot to be said for the phrase, out of sight, out of mind, and that's not always a good thing. Look around a space for children. What is there for them to look at, for them to read, for them to see, while being held, while moving around on their own, while on the floor? What is there to write with for that child that they can get to, that they can see and want and spontaneously engage with, not necessarily have to ask for? And think about technology and how this impacts your interactions with each other, your language, how you look or do not look at people when you're talking to them, how it causes a distraction or how it can cause an engagement, and if that's a meaningful engagement. And then how. How is cultural awareness? I bring this up because some of us work with students who speak another language. And one thing I hope we come away with at the end of the semester is a realization that dual language learners should be embraced and encouraged, that a child growing up in a dual language environment, so maybe they speak a home language and a different language at school is spoken, that is desirable, that they are better off for that if we fully support them and engage them in both languages. I'm going to repeat that. It should be encouraged to have children speak one language at home and another language at school. You will see their language develop in a different way, but it is different, not worse. It is not harmful. Research shows it is only helpful in brain development and in full language acquisition for both languages if a child is supported in literacy, which is, remember, literacy is reading, writing, and oral language. If they are supported in all three of those modes of language development in both their native language and the language spoken outside the home, they are only at an advantage to other children. But having a cultural awareness focuses on the rules, if you will, of language development. Reading from left to right, using pictures to gain meaning, sounding out versus sight words, using words, illustrations, graphics, and context. And nowadays, a lot of acronyms and emojis. Learning when those are appropriate to use versus inappropriate to use, etc., etc. I hope this lecture has helped you understand some of these big concepts as well as one of the assignments in Module 1, and I look forward to reading your work and reflections.